I'm Alex Doby, this is XDA TV, and this is an iPhone 15 Pro Max. So I've been an Android fanboy for most of the past decade. I've dabbled in last year's iPhones briefly, but Android is my bread and butter, and that ecosystem is still where I feel most at home. Which brings me once again to my yearly challenge where this Android person tries to move into the new iPhone and looks at all the challenges you'll face if you're also taking the plunge with the 15 Pro or Pro Max. As always, there's a lot to unpack here in my thoughts after around a month and a half daily driving this iPhone, so stick around, take a sec to subscribe if you want to see more like this, and we'll get into it. So first things first, my iPhone of choice this year is the 15 Pro Max in white titanium. I'm going Pro Max despite my normal preference for the more manageable, smaller Pro size, just because the Max is the only way to get the best camera hardware this year. That new 5x telephoto is only available in the big boy iPhone. And I'm choosing white titanium because honestly, this year's Pro iPhone colors are so painfully dull that the usually pedestrian white is probably the sharpest colorway out of the limited selection on offer here. There's a good reason for the much more subdued color palette though. The titanium frame is harder to colorize than the stainless steel or aluminium used in previous Pros, but still, compared to earlier years, this is definitely one of the more boring looking iPhone generations, primarily just because of that lackluster color palette. The other benefit of titanium though is that it's lighter than the stainless steel Apple was using before, and combined with the trimmed down screen borders, this Pro Max is physically just a little bit smaller than its predecessor. Both are subtle changes though compared to the 14 Pro Max, and it's still kind of a tank compared to a lot of Android flagships. It remains a big chunky phone by any measure. The Pixel 8 Pro and many others in this 6.7-inch ballpark are easy to one hand and reach across the width of the screen with your thumb while also being lighter. But the slimmed down dimensions and ever so slightly lighter weight make me a little bit more confident about using this Pro Max without a case, and hopefully it's a good starting point for things to get trimmed down even further in the 16 Pro Max. The edges of this iPhone's display and sidewalls are also less sharp than the 14 series, which is a nice quality of life improvement for your palms, though obviously the front and back are still very much flat sheets of glass, even compared to nominally flat Android phones that use a curvier sheet of glass around the back. And I think the matte finish of those side rails also makes the 15 Pro Max one of the slipperier phones I've used recently. The Pixel, Galaxy S23 Ultra, and even previous iPhones use a glossy finish that I think is much easier to hold onto. This time around it's kind of just a slippery matte texture all the way around. With this iPhone's design though, I appreciate the symmetry of those borders, again just a little bit slimmer than the 14 Pros, along with the attention to detail in areas like the camera module as it transitions from matte glass to glossy. This is still a sharp, iconic, clean design that surely few in the Android world can match. With the Pro Max, you're getting one of, if not the best 6.7-inch smartphone displays, with a seriously bright daylight mode that can push up to 2000 nits to your eyeballs, helped along by ambient brightness sensors on the front and back of the phone for more accurate auto brightness. That's useful because often the source of the light around you isn't necessarily facing the screen. That display, like I said, is framed by smaller bezels, though with the same sized dynamic island protruding through it. We're on generation 2 now of Apple's hang a lantern on it approach to screen cutouts, and so most of the apps that you use that are going to include some support for the island probably have done so by now. Aside from the usual media apps and timers, Uber and Uber Eats are probably the most functional uses that I've seen for the island. But still, it's not something that I particularly miss when I go back to using an Android phone. And yes, it has a USB-C port now, which for almost everyone will be a much smaller deal than the online tech fan bubble was making it out to be in the run-up to launch. It's great for me personally, because now the chargers I use for literally everything else also charge my iPhone. But honestly, I'm wirelessly charging most of the time anyway, and although the move to USB 3 data speeds is a big deal for some creators, I'd already found AirDrop mostly scratched that itch when I needed to offload large video files from an iPhone to a Mac. So let's talk about my experience setting up this iPhone. Before switching, my main physical SIM was in a Pixel 7 Pro, and because I'm in a country where the iPhone is actually sold with a SIM slot, porting my number and data plan over to the 15 Pro Max involved the arcane process of opening up the SIM tray of the Pixel, scooping out the SIM and plopping it into the iPhone. No need to deal with QR codes or calls to my carrier or performing a blood sacrifice to the GSMA. Turns out when you take a physical SIM out of one phone and put it in another, your line just magically moves across. Who knew? I previously used eSIMs on Vodafone here in the UK and the experience has been just fine, but I've also experienced issues with some carriers in other countries, and I've also heard plenty of folks in the US having a nightmare transferring eSIMs across from iPhone 14 to 15, even when Apple does everything it can to make that process as seamless as possible. So yeah, I'm sticking with the physical SIM for now. It at least makes things easier if and when I do decide to stick it back in an Android phone. The next part of the process though wasn't without a few road bumps, and the main reason for that is this guy, WhatsApp. So prior to this, I had a 14 Pro Max set up on a second SIM, but there's a very specific process that you need to go through to bring your WhatsApp data across from an Android phone, and that involves the switch to iOS Android app, which in essence means redoing a lot of the initial setup because in a lot of ways moving from Android to iOS means starting over with a fresh install of iOS. The problem is moving WhatsApp between phones is, well, a pain in the ass at the best of times, even more so when you're moving between platforms, and even more so since WhatsApp switched from sending authorization codes via SMS to sending via WhatsApp message to your old device. Now, to cut a long and very annoying story short, the process of moving WhatsApp from Android to iOS wipes the WhatsApp data on the Android phone. Only sometimes when you're setting up WhatsApp on the new device, it'll demand a code from your old device without the option to switch to SMS. If you get stuck in this situation like I did, the only option is to factory reset, restore WhatsApp on the Android phone and start the whole process over. Pretty much the antithesis of the "it just works" experience you're looking for when you switch to a new Apple product. Other single device messaging apps? Well, WeChat worked just fine, same as moving from Android to Android. And Line still complains at you and makes you junk all but 2 weeks of recent message history, which sucks. But seriously, just trashing your entire message history may be easier than the song and dance that WhatsApp put me through. Say what you like about the other forms of Apple ecosystem lock-in, and we've got a whole video on that topic, but having to deal with BS like this when porting over WhatsApp and Line messages is just as obnoxious a form of platform lock-in. Once I was set up with my shiny new iPhone, once again, the thing I appreciate the most about iOS isn't really the way it looks or how it helps me get stuff done, it's the ecosystem and how easily everything fits together. Using a MacBook, once again, I'm able to rely on things like AirDrop and continuity to send files and clipboard text between my devices. Apple Pay, whether on my Mac, iPhone or Apple Watch, works flawlessly, and on the iPhone actually links deeper into financial institutions' data, allowing you to see available balances and transactions made outside of Apple Pay, which is a neat addition. From there, it's easy to be drawn into maybe picking up a couple of AirTags for that upcoming trip, or even pulling the trigger on an Apple Watch, which is what I actually did for the first time. And the gravitational pull of the ecosystem only becomes stronger once it also incorporates your daily health information and those all-important streaks. As for customization, the general perception of iOS is that it's less customizable than Android, and that's kind of true and also kind of not. iOS opened up to much more customization around theming a couple of years back, if you're into that kind of thing. And I also continue to enjoy the lock screen customizations first brought about last year in iOS 16, especially where you can create color wash or duotone versions of your favorite photos. What you do miss from Android is the ability to go all out and replace things like your launcher or the default dialer. Although custom keyboards and browsers do work just fine on an iPhone, and things are only likely to become more open within the next 6 months as sideloading and third-party app stores potentially enter the fray, joining the iOS world still means ceding quite a bit of control over how your phone looks to the Apple design team. Most of my personal data still lives in the Google world. Google Photos is my go-to app for keeping all my pictures in sync across the iPhone and other devices. I'm still using Chrome because all my stuff lives there too, and it makes syncing passwords across devices much easier because Chrome itself can act as a password manager on iOS, and I'm still keeping Google Fit around for similar reasons. These days it's doing a much better job of keeping everything in sync between devices without any third-party hackery. That said, I'm still signed up to a 50 gig iCloud package for things like Photos on the Apple side and full device backup through iCloud. Speaking of photos, one thing I do notice that's a minor annoyance likely to stick around as standards are worked out is that HDR photography across Android and iOS is a bit of a mess right now. The Pixel 8 Pro will quite happily display HDR shots from both my iPhone and the Pixel camera itself. But on the iPhone, it's SDR only in Google Photos. You'll need to view your iPhone photos in the Apple Photos app to see them in all their HDR glory. The exception is video, which shows as HDR on both regardless of which device it was shot on. I don't want to go too deep into a rabbit hole around HDR standards just yet, but just know the whole area is kind of messy right now, and hopefully future software updates will be able to straighten things out. One addition in the 15 Pro series that kinda spans both hardware and software is the new programmable action button here. The concept isn't anything new, it's been a thing in the Android world for the better part of a decade. I'm using it as a camera shortcut because I find it quicker and less clunky than the usual lock screen shortcut button, but the real hidden gem here is the ability to tie it into iOS's shortcuts, an immensely powerful but little used feature that essentially gives you a custom button for thousands of programmable functions. Want a ChatGPT button, for example? That's totally possible here. It's often said that iOS is easier to use but less functional than Android, but shortcuts in particular, and by extension the new Action key, really test the credibility of that idea. Performance-wise, I haven't noticed a whole lot of difference between the 15 Pro here and my previous 14 Pros. Obviously, benchmark scores are higher, and if you're a big gamer, you may notice improved frame rates. That could be especially true once more games start to adopt the A17 Pro's hardware ray tracing capability. I think we'll probably look back on this iPhone though as an important milestone in Apple's move to finally tackle console and desktop gaming in a big way. This thing is already powerful enough to run titles like Resident Evil Village, and as the Apple Silicon in MacBooks becomes quicker and more graphically capable, we could see some of those benefits starting to trickle down to iPhones running chips like the A17 Pro. As for regular everyday phone stuff though, it still does all of that just as well as a 14 Pro or even a 13 or 12. iOS still isn't flawless and can still drop frames in places just like some Android devices, and battery life is in a similar ballpark to my 14 Pro Max too, in my experience easily getting me through a full day even with heavy use with up to 7 or 8 hours of screen active time. The big deal camera feature in this generation of iPhone is the new 5x zoom camera, enabled through a clever concoction of tiny mirrors between the camera glass and the sensor. That's only available in the Pro Max this year. The regular 15 Pro comes fitted with the same 3x zoomer as the 14 Pro. So let's tackle that new zoom camera up front, because I think it's a real mixed bag, and for me probably the biggest letdown given all the pre-release hype around Apple finally adopting a folded telephoto camera. Can you take good-looking 5x shots with this camera? Absolutely yes, but with a bunch of caveats attached. This camera is best at 5x, shooting something like a portrait where you get a nice bit of extra depth separation in your shot because of that f/2.8 aperture. Whether it's people, pets, or pumpkins, that's how Apple expects you to be shooting with the 5x camera. And it's surprisingly tolerant of moving subjects too, considering the relatively small sensor size. Where it falls down is in middling to low light and, crucially, zooming beyond that 5x figure. Venture into the territory of 10x or above, and Apple is outclassed, in still photos at least, by Android flagships like the Pixel 8 Pro and S23 Ultra. Take this shot at 20x and you'll see a lot more software guesswork in the details here versus the Google and Samsung phones. 5x shots from the iPhone also exhibit more noise than those from the two Android rivals, even in daylight, as you'll see here. And that's a little weird because in low light the iPhone's night mode can clean up zoom shots pretty well. Problem is, you can't force night mode 100% of the time like you can on Android phones. Sometimes you have the option, but if iOS decides it's too bright, then no night mode for you. That's an issue in shots with the wide and ultra wide too occasionally. I've had more than a few instances where I'd like night mode to fire, but because some parts of the scene are brightly illuminated, I just don't have that option. And the result is a dimmer, less pleasing shot than I get from a flagship Android camera. As for those other two cameras, the wide and the ultra wide, it's largely a repeat performance with the 14 Pro because it's the exact same camera hardware in there. Both can take reliable, pleasing shots, and the main sensor in particular is large enough to produce a good bit of natural bokeh, which I appreciate in certain shots like this. And the ultra wide, while definitely nothing special in lower light, can produce sharp looking macro shots like this with minimal effort. The iPhone camera, despite its hit and miss 5x telephoto, is still a mostly excellent point-and-shoot performer. If you're used to the colors of Samsung's Android phones, you may find the iPhone's output just a little muted by default, but there are additional modes like rich contrast here that can jazz things up a bit. And finally, on the subject of stills, I really appreciate the default 24 megapixel mode that you get with the iPhone, sucking in a canvas of pixels that's twice as large as the average Android camera, and doing so in surprisingly small file sizes thanks to the HEIF format. Video is once again where the iPhone really shines though. ProRes log support is included now at up to 4K with 30 frames per second, a nice addition for creators, and probably overkill for most other people. Unless you're doing a lot of color grading, you're not going to get much use out of it. But the iPhone's versatility in shooting moving pictures is still to be envied, with some of the best stabilization around, including the excellent action mode, now supported even at 5x zoom thanks to that new telephoto. And the cinematic mode, although quite situational, does a great job adding extra depth to shots of people or any kind of moving scene where you've got a bit of separation between your subject and the background. For me as a creator, the only camera that's come close to the iPhone's versatility in this manner is the Oppo Find X6 Pro, which brute forces its video capabilities by just having enormous sensors all around. The iPhone's video strength, I think, is more a combination of just good optics and really excellent processing and software. So after a month and a half with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, I'm pretty happy with this thing. And at the time of talking, my main SIM is still in this phone. We'll see if that lasts in the months ahead. That said, this really isn't a huge upgrade over the previous generation. It's a bit slimmer, a bit lighter, and comes with a new zoom camera that's far from an easy sell, especially if you're taking a lot of longer telephoto shots. In other words, if you weren't already sold on the iPhone formula, there's little here to sway you. No 1-inch camera sensor, no giant battery capacity, super fast charging, or any of the other more exotic features that the competition relies on. But the polish of the iOS experience is what I really appreciate about the iPhone whenever I venture into that world, and a big part of what makes me a little reluctant to move back to Android when I have temporarily switched in the past. Call it the Hotel California effect, if you like. That said, with this iPhone, I can continue using 99% of the Google apps and services I enjoy from the Android world, and I still have the option of whichever Apple alternatives I want as well. The iPhone might not be a home run in terms of still photography. I still think the Pixel 8 Pro probably takes the crown there, and I don't even think it's a particularly close contest if you look at some of the side-by-side shots. But let's be honest here, it's more than good enough, and the iPhone makes up for its handful of photographic weaknesses with truly excellent video capabilities. So let's see how I got on with this iPhone long term. I'll revisit in a few months and see if I'm still using it as a daily driver. And if you've ever switched from Android to iOS or vice versa, let me know why in the comments and how it went for you. Take a sec to subscribe so you don't miss our coverage of Android, iOS, and everything in between. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.